Hey folks, please indulge me a brief special comment before today's episode. Doing this show is a great privilege, and with that privilege comes an obligation. My goal with these shows is to learn and to make sense of the world. As I sat with my daughter last Wednesday evening, watching events unfold at our nation's capital and trying to answer her many questions, not much made sense. "What are we watching?" she kept asking. And the only answer I knew to be correct was, "We're watching history." Like many of you, I've been reading and listening and thinking a lot these last few days. One of the most profound things I read was from The Atlantic's Anne Applebaum. She wrote, "We have promoted democracy in our movies and books. We speak of democracy in our speeches and lectures. We even sing about democracy from sea to shining sea in our national songs. We have entire government bureaus devoted to thinking about how we can help countries become and remain democratic. We fund institutions that do the same. And yet, by far, the most important weapon the United States of America has ever wielded in defense of democracy, in defense of political liberty, in defense of universal rights, in defense of the rule of law, was the power of example. In the end, it wasn't our words, our songs, our diplomacy, or even our money or our military power that mattered. It was rather the things we had achieved, the 2.5 centuries of peaceful transitions of power, the slow but massive expansion of the franchise, and the long, seemingly solid traditions of civilized debate." So, as our leaders resumed their work on Wednesday night, we heard many of them declare, "This is not who we are." Well, right now I'm not so sure. In some ways, this is precisely who we are, or what we've allowed ourselves to become. The only way the arc of history bends towards justice is if we do the bending. So I urge all of you, all of us, if you don't think what you saw on Wednesday is who we are, what are you doing to fix that? It's going to take all of us, and it's going to take grace. Okay, thanks for listening. Now on to the show.
But if you imagine yourself, with a 6-figure contract on the Nike campus, running on the Michael Johnson track where Phil Knight can look out his window and see you every day, you are in the most legit program that there is on earth with the most powerful coach. And you just don't go into that relationship assuming that he might lead you astray. But he did.
This is A New Angle, and I'm your host, Justin Angle, marketing professor at the University of Montana College of Business. This podcast is my chance to speak with cool people doing awesome things in and around the great state of Montana. We are proudly underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot. Hey folks, welcome back and thanks for tuning in. Today we continue our Healthy Sports series by examining how many of the questions and issues raised in the last 2 episodes exist at the highest level of sport. In this case, elite professional running. Matt Hart is a former professional athlete turned investigative journalist. His reporting on questionable practices by elite coaches, doctors, and their runners produced front-page stories in the New York Times, as well as his recently published debut book, Win at All Costs. Matt and I discussed the role of sport in our society, the risks and trade-offs facing athletes, and the abuse of coaching power at the hands of Alberto Salazar, former head coach of the Nike Oregon Project. Matt is a dear friend. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that you do too. So now I bring you Matt Hart. So I'm here today with Matt Hart, investigative journalist, author of Win at All Costs, Inside Nike Running and Its Culture of Deception. Matt, so good to reconnect. So good to have you on the podcast and hear your voice. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, Justin, thanks for having me.
Actually, I was thinking about it this morning. We actually led parallel lives for a while. I mean, you went to a rival high school in New Hampshire. We
That's
didn't
right.
actually know each other. You lived in San Francisco when I did after college, but we didn't know each other. We lived in
Yeah.
Seattle concurrently for a while, and then finally met in like 2004. And yeah, it's just so wonderful to follow your writing and your success and your career progression, but also congratulations on getting this incredible piece of journalism and reporting out. I mean, it is a piece of work. How do you feel having published your first book?
Oh, I mean, it feels great. When you work on anything for 3+ years, just to have finally completed it feels like a win on some level. Um, and I honestly admit, if it wasn't for my editors, my great editors at HarperCollins, I probably never would have published it. I wish I would have just tinkered probably till I died. But at some point, when you have a book contract, they're like, all right, it's time. You've got to stop being neurotic and let us send this out into the world. And so, yeah, it feels great.
Awesome. Well, I think listeners might like learning a little bit about your backstory. I mean, when we met, you were in the software industry working at Microsoft and left to become a professional athlete and now a writer. Talk about your career choices, because they're not how one would draw them up in the career offices of a university like the one I work in.
Yeah. After graduating school, I did a work abroad program and found actually my last year at the University of New Hampshire where I went to school, I found myself just enamored with computers and wasn't studying computer science, was studying um, media studies and communication and journalism. And so I kind of got sidetracked my senior year, just became sort of obsessed with how computers work and did a work abroad program where I worked on computers and came back and eventually through San Francisco and the internet boom, got a job at Microsoft. And that's when we met. That was, if you remember correctly, that we met in 2004. I didn't quite remember that. But yeah, worked there through the end of 2005, I think. And just, I felt like a corporate drone a little bit at
Yep.
Microsoft. And, I had been writing, although I couldn't see that far downriver yet. When we met, I was obsessed with ultra running and adventure racing. And
Yeah, and you were writing great stuff on your blog. I mean, that became kind of a go-to place for adventure athletes in the Northwest, as I recall.
yeah, that was really fun. I wrote a little bit for mountainzone.com when they were out. And, I had a hit here or there that, I don't know, felt like something, but in hindsight was probably nothing. But either way, it was enough to sort of put the seed in my brain and spur me on. And then, I left Microsoft with a little bit of money in the bank to try to, run an adventure race professionally. And, that was, I mean, ultimately, objectively, to look back, pretty unsuccessful, but it was, I kept afloat, I could say that. And
It
I
depends
coached.
on how you define success, right? Like,
Yeah,
you,
totally.
you shifted your career effectively, and now you're an author, and so you could say it's a success of a sort, right?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's just a little bit of false self-deprecation because that was running has brought me almost everything good in my life. And so that time period I didn't have any money to save, but I also didn't go into debt. And it was 10 years of running in the mountains with you and other friends and really exploring what I could do physiologically. And it turns out I'm not Kilian Jornet. And that's okay. The effort to
Right.
try to become someone of that caliber, brought me all the good things that are in my life now. So, it's probably a failure, but I don't look at failure. I don't. It was a necessary step, and I'm so happy it happened. And I'd do it all over again.
And so one of the things I always thought about you, Matt, and I got to sort of put this the right way, but when when you sort of started focusing on your athletic pursuits, I sort of felt like I think Matt needs a little bit more than that. I think he needs more sort of intellectual engagement. And you quickly kind of got into your writing and got into your coaching. And I remember like rides and runs, like we would talk about some of these gray areas in sport that you report on in your book so well, and we'll kind of get to the details of that. But like, at what point? I mean, you're interested in endurance, obviously, but you're also sort of interested in the culture and the norms and the rules and kind of how humans interact with trying to maximize their own performance. How did you kind of get interested in topics in general.
Yeah. I mean, you were really there to discuss these topics with me when they were sort of fomenting in my brain. I mean, it really spurred from, trying to be the best athlete that I could be. And of course, the logical thing to do is read every training manual you can and try to understand human physiology. And then when I was coaching other athletes, testing things on them and myself. And then of course, we were kind of coming up at the time where, Lance Armstrong put on a black hat. We went from the hero to the villain in our time, and you and I discussed this ad nauseum. I know.
Oh, yeah.
I can remember those around us telling us to choose another topic at some point. But I was just, as you were, I think I was just so burned by, I was wearing a yellow wristband, and I really had bought into this whole fable. And so I was really just trying to work out right and wrong. And then, of course, coming up in a sport with really ultra running with very few rules. And, I don't know if you remember, but I had, a bout of overtraining syndrome, many, actually, probably more than one, but that led me to a doctor that offered me testosterone. And so I have in my past these first person experiences with a lot of the situations the Nike athletes found themselves in, where testosterone is just illegal, but the way it was proposed to me by the doctor, he's like, well, your sport doesn't test. If you get tested, you'll fail a drug test. That's kind of how he said it to me. And of course I said, no, thanks. And I knew enough about testosterone levels and energy levels and to know that if I lessen my training and I eat right and I sleep better and I stop drinking so much coffee, that my body will rebound from this. I don't need testosterone to bring it back into the normal range. And so, all that to say that so much of this story I'd felt like I had a first person touch of, and I had struggled with some of these same questions. It wasn't even really a struggle for me. As you and I discussed back in the day, that was just cheat, EPO and testosterone are cheating.
Yeah, it seemed like bright lines around those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But I was interested in, the nuance of this because it's not super clear with the other substances. L-carnitine's an amino acid. It's not a banned substance. Athletes with legitimate asthma should be on Advair and some of these other drugs. And so that's why I thought the story of the Oregon Project was so interesting, just because they were constantly grappling with these questions of gray area substances and tactics. And, eventually they stepped over the line enough times to be banned, Alberto Salazar and Dr. Jeffrey Brown. And now the team's been shuttered. But, I'd really just found these topics, sort of this moral line of where athletes were willing to go and where they weren't willing to go. And then the fear around, speaking truth to a big brand and the most powerful coach in the sport. I just was enamored with the story. And once I got a hold of it, I just kind of kept reporting, even without, I didn't have a book deal at the beginning, but the more I reported, the more I realized, there's a real story here.
Yeah. So let's talk about kind of how you got on the story. Interested in the topics as we just discussed, but, you received kind of a secret tranche of documents, right? Like how did this all happen? It seems very kind of, there's some like high drama and high mystery involved in what happened. I'm sure you can only tell us so much, but how did this unfold?
Yeah, I keep the source of the document a secret, but, kind of how it went down was, first of all, I should say, as someone who's interested in these topics, when I started to write, my journalistic curiosity was, kind of pointed at these things from endurance sports in general to doping. And, I had done some reporting around, an Italian athlete who doped in ultra running. And I'd written a story for The Atlantic about Lance Armstrong and Floyd Landis's $100 million lawsuit. And so I was in this world of, someone who wrote about these things. And basically, that's the simplest reason why I was sent this USB document, because the person who had it sent it to me thinking, maybe you can do something about it.
Were you the only person that was sent this?
No. It was subsequently published afterwards.
Okay.
But it's hard. It's impossible for me to know. But when I reached out to, Runner's World and the New York Times, I said to them, disabuse me of the idea that I'm the only one in the media with this file, but I'd really like to write about it for you. And part of me assumed, oh, Juliet McCurr at the Times is probably already working on this. Someone even deeper and with more experience than me probably already has this. And so I actually reached out to Julia, and she never responded, but she forwarded me to her editor, who then, of course, made the piece happen. And no one in America, in American journalism, sports journalism, seemed to have their hands on the file. And so, then it was a process of like, all right, what's the angle? What's the story here? The Times of London, I should say, seemed to either have a partial copy, or they figured out what was in it, and they wrote a couple very Eurocentric and Mo Farah-centric pieces. But they barely made an impression here, and so when I got my hands on it, it was sort of obvious that the news really hadn't broken over here. And then, of course, the Times put it on the front page of the paper when we did publish it. So
yeah, tell us about that. Front page report in the New York Times. That relative. You had written some great stuff up to that moment, but that was a moment of pretty significant breakthrough for you. How did it unfold? How did you sort of know that the New York Times is going to publish it in such a prominent way?
Yeah, I had no idea until it came out that it was going to be on the front page, actually. Yeah. I think if you work there, you can fight for A1, as they say, or front page above the fold. And if you go into the editorial meetings, maybe you have a say. But I had no say and no insight. My editor at the Times told me, when he told me it was going to be in the newspaper, I was excited about that because I wanted to go pick one up. And I had never written, I was a magazine writer. I had never even written news for a newspaper. And it's funny because he asked me, how old are you, Matt? I was like, I don't know, I was 43 at the time. He's like, oh, okay, I get it. Because, he assumed if I'm in my early 30s or even 20s that I just wouldn't care if it came out in the newspaper. But I really wanted a copy.
What's that?
Yeah, I wanted to hold on to it. And I knew the cover meant something, but I just didn't, I didn't imagine that they would publish it on the front page. So, I was pretty shocked the day that it came out.
And so you wrote some subsequent pieces, and, also in the Times and in other places. And then at what point did the sort of idea of like, how did you decide this has to go from, a series of periodical articles to a book? Like, I really need to do this in a book. How was that decision process?
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. Trying to sort of follow this imaginary Krakauer-esque sort of career path, where you write for a major magazine and a story becomes interesting enough that it launches a book or a book idea. For years, I've had my feelers out for my book idea, this imagined launch into becoming an author. And so I was keen to figure out if this was ready to go, but really, talking to Cara Goucher behind the scenes when I was working on the New York Times piece, just the courage that she had, I thought to myself, I can build a book around her story for sure. But then as I kept digging, honestly, I haven't been saying this, but I'm ready to say it now. There was just, so I'm rigorously trying to figure out, I'm interrogating the facts, as they say. And I would have been just as happy to report, that the media had gotten it all wrong or Salazar should be exonerated. I really tried to go at it, objectively as I possibly could, but almost immediately, I'm confronted with people who are desperate to not let the story get out and angry at me. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist. Any journalist's spidey senses would start to tingle. And I was like, oh, there's way more here than people know. And that's when I started to realize, Cara's whole story definitely hadn't been told. And then other people who, were just angry and acting weird. And, if you're a clean athlete, why on earth wouldn't you just talk to the guy who's writing about it for the New York Times and sort of just clear your chest and get it out there? But, people were very scared, and that was obvious really early on. And I just thought, oh, that this whole cake is all these ingredients will make a whole cake. So.
Indeed. So I'm feeling those flashbacks of conversations where other people in the room said, hey, you guys talk about something else. and maybe the reason being is because we might have left some listeners behind. Like, I want to make sure we sort of set the stage here for those listeners that don't know the details of this story. Let's start. Like, what was the Nike Oregon project, and who is Alberto Salazar? And let's just sort of give us the set the stage for us.
Yeah. So Alberto Salazar is a Cuban-born American who became basically one of America's best runners. Definitely one of our best marathoners. He went, after the fame of Steve Prefontaine, the next generation through University of Oregon was, Alberto Salazar and Rudy Chapa. And they kind of dominated the NCAA. And before Alberto had even left college, he was calling his shots at, the New York City Marathon, which he won 3 times in the early 80s, and the Boston Marathon. And he was a household name by 1982, which is the year he won the Boston Marathon. And he had some legendary battles with athletes. And, he had chosen Nike as a sponsor, and he's widely seen as being sort of the first runner to receive not an NFL or NBA size salary, but I think Nike paid him at one point $250,000 back in the day. And so, professional running had gone from, recreational running, where if you wanted to compete in the Olympics, no races had prize money, no one was professional. You had to remain an amateur to even compete in the Olympics. And, that sort of ended around Frank Shorter's time. He won the 72 gold medal in the Olympics, and then was sort of robbed in the 76 Olympics by someone who was found to be, doping on the East German program. And so, that changed everything. Doping in 76 was now all of a sudden a huge issue. The East German women, didn't look like women anymore. They had been so dosed for so many years with so many steroids. And so the sporting world was really sort of at a turning point. And then the Olympics, of course, then changed, where professional athletes could then perform. And Frank Shorter was sort of one of the first guys to start getting paid. But Alberto Salazar was then the next guy to start beating him and became, the next most famous American athlete. And so, long story short, Alberto had successfully overtrained himself, and went into a period, a decade or longer of, just sadness and poor performances and throwing everything at the wall to improve his performance, because he had essentially, destroyed his endocrine system. His testosterone had cratered, and his hormones were a wreck, and he contemplated suicide, and he had to, retire from professional running. And he eventually, long story short, I'm trying to make it short, he ended up at Nike in the marketing department. That's what he'd studied at the University of Oregon. And so fast forward through, so there were about 2 decades of really lackluster American performance, and Nike's an American brand, created and born and bred here in Oregon. And so Alberto,
with running at its core, right? I mean, that's a piece of this too, is like, as this guy Alberto Salazar is starting to really sort of dominate marathons in a brash, sort of irreverent way. I mean, if you've read, Phil Knight's autobiography, Shoe Dog, like Nike is sort of coming up with a similar brashness and a similar like irreverence and trying to break through and break some of the rule. Like it's kind of part of their origin story is how I could see how these two characters fit well together, the Phil Knight Nike brand and Salazar and his character as well.
Yeah, Nike seemed to specifically seek out athletes. From their first sponsored athlete, Natase, who was a tennis player, he was known as a sort of a petulant child on the court. And Nike was attracted to these rebellious athletes, so to speak, that won. And so it should be said, Alberto won his last big race, the Boston Marathon, or I shouldn't say that. He won in 94 as part of the story of the Comrades Marathon. But, after he won Boston in 82, you got to remember Adidas was the global sports brand, the biggest global sports brand back then. So it wasn't until 83, the following year, that Nike surpassed Adidas in worldwide sales, in part because, of athletes like Alberto Salazar. They were so prominent and all over the television, and Nike's just masterfully marketing them all with their commercials. And so, Alberto had headed over to the Boston Deli on the Nike campus in Beaverton, Oregon in 2001. And he sat down with the vice president at the time, Tom Clark, who was also a really experienced marathoner. And they watched, the Boston Marathon proceed, and were just kind of disgusted with the American racers' performance.
Sure.
The fastest or the best athlete, I think, finished 6th place. And, Alberto had been the last American to win the race. And so they basically hatched a plan that day. Like, all right, well, we've got these countries who are, illegally supporting their athletes in some cases. But whatever the case, the East African countries are dominating the sport and Americans are no longer relevant. And so they decided to put money and technology and put Alberto at the helm of this team, the Nike Oregon Project. They weren't named that at the time. That name came later. But, they decided to just put Nike's largesse behind, a real running program that started early with collegiate athletes. And then they even worked backwards to high school athletes with Galen Rupp and a few others. For about 10 years, they really didn't do anything all that impressive, with the exception of Cara. She was racing nationally pretty well, especially as she got into marathons in the later stages of her career, but they hadn't had anyone on an international podium, really. And that all changed in 2011 with Galen Rupp and Mo Farah going 1 and 2 at the Olympics. But that's the origin.
So let's focus on just 2 characters that play so prominently in the story, Adam and Cara Goucher. It's interesting. Like, Adam's a character who's now sort of been detailed in multiple books. I mean, I remember reading about Adam in Running with a Buffalo. I think it was Chris Lear's documentation of a season at the University of Colorado's cross-country team, and Adam was sort of the star runner during that season. Yeah. Later meets and marries Cara Goucher, and now the 2 of them as budding professional athletes are some of the first prominent characters signed by Nike Oregon Project. Is that kind of because they were 2 big gets for that program early on, right?
Yeah. The team had, Alberto had kind of dismissed the early years of saying, we had B players at one point when he was asked to sort of account for the first 5 years of the program or whatever. I guess that would only be 3 years of the program. So the Gouchers joined in 2004. And really at first, Cara, it's hard to realize this now because she became, Nike's most prominent runner. But back in the day when they were recruiting the 2 of them, Adam was the prominent runner. He was America's hope. He was, Bob Kennedy had dominated the scene for years. And Adam was one of the first American athletes to ever beat him. And so it seemed as though Adam was next in line to be, America's best runner. And he had signed with Fila out of college. And so Nike had to wait for him for quite a while. And then when they signed him, they kind of signed Cara as an afterthought, but they signed her nonetheless. And then Adam's career, unfortunately, through probably some witch's brew of overtraining and Alberto's, miscalculations with athletes, that his career started to nosedive, and right. Cara became the prominent athlete on the team.
Yeah, and the treatment of Cara was something that played a big, it's a big thread in the book, whether it's sort of, how she was treated as a female athlete relative to male athletes, how she was, how her and Adam's sort of journey into parenthood was part of the story, and then her comeback from pregnancy. Talk about Cara's experience, because you had to have had developed a pretty close source relationship with her. A lot of what she shares in the book is pretty courageous.
Cara, she really grew close to Alberto. And so, one thing that readers have to realize is for coaching athlete experience and relationship to work, the athlete really has to buy into what the coach is telling them 100%. To do. Otherwise, the first time you're tired or you're asked to do something that you don't agree with, you just won't do it. And so one thing that Alberto did really well at the beginning was, he fostered this sort of familial environment where, they'd go to church together and they'd do all their workouts and treatments together. And so, Adam, he was just was just experiencing injury after injury. And so he focused even his own attention as he was recovering on Cara and her career and helping her psychologically. And Alberto and her grew to be very close through this period, and she really started to, perform really well. She beat Paula Radcliffe at the Great North Run in England, which really kind of shocked people, and sort of brought Cara to the forefront. And then Cara, then subsequently went and was invited to the New York City Marathon and got to ride along in one of the cars and watched Radcliffe, who'd she just beat, 6 months earlier or some such around there, win the New York City Marathon again. And it really sort of ignited this idea in her that, okay, maybe Alberto's right, that I'm going to be a long distance runner and I'm going to be a marathon runner, which she'd never really been interested in before. And, they had seen things that they didn't like throughout. And, it just hadn't hit a tipping point yet where they were worried.
You mean Adam and Cara had seen practices or the way people were treated that just raised some red flags for them? Is that what you're saying?
Okay. Yeah, 100%. I mean, they came to love Alberto. Cara, in our first time we sat down with the recorder, tearfully explained that to me, and how she didn't want the book to be all bad. She's like, we had great times. And so in deference to her, I really, and journalism and journalistic integrity, basically, I tried to, portray that in the book as like, look, these were, at least good times at the beginning. And they had just seen so many things that accumulated, and they were naive when they started. They were young kids. So Cara described, testosterone cream on the counter at an 2007 training camp.
Sure.
And of course now in our modern setting and being who I am, I'm like, why didn't that raise any flags? And she had her honest explanation is we were just so naive. Alberto, he had had a heart attack and he had cream, and we just didn't really pay attention to what it was.
A New Angle is brought to you by First Security Bank and Blackfoot, two cool companies doing awesome things all over Montana.
Hi, this is Jeff Meese, media technician at the College of Business, and you're listening to A New Angle.
And we so trusted him that of course it wouldn't be, anything illegal. And so, it's sort of a slow and gradual unmasking of, the depths at which he was willing to go. I mean, to be fair to him, it doesn't... Well, I can't even begin to try to speak to him, because some of the things I just can't logically explain, even to this day, why he would do certain things. But, he kept going closer and closer to the line. And then, of course, eventually he stepped over it. And that's why you saw it banned him from sport.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, because the culture of this team, the practices of this team you describe are not like the stories we hear from Armstrong and U.S. Postal. I mean, when we're talking about some of these pro cyclist stories, you're talking about EPO and blood transfusions and growth hormone and substances and practices that are clearly against the rules. And the game they were playing was trying to beat the testing, essentially. Whereas the culture you describe is trying to find areas that maybe aren't regulated yet, advantages that aren't known broadly yet, loopholes, and just push the limits of gray as far as you can. So maybe kind of just paint the picture of maybe through an example of one of these practices. I think the L-carnitine infusions is a great example. Therapeutic use exemptions, things like that. Like, this is a different type of performance maximization, right?
Yeah. Yeah, the marginal gains that you heard about in cycling.
Indeed.
That's really what they seem to be going for. And it's the idea that, Lance Armstrong described EPO as a 10%er, and he described all the other drugs as 2, 3, 4%ers. And so, EPO was a 10%er, meaning you kind of had to be on it if you wanted to compete. At least that's what he would argue. And these drugs, with the exception of testosterone, which we can talk about later, that Salazar was involved with, really were more, they had this ostensible deniability where a doctor would prescribe them. And we didn't find out till later that oftentimes none of the athletes would test sort of out of the normal range for these drugs. So Salazar had a number of things he felt would help an athlete, from, high doses of vitamin D, which he was obsessed with that testosterone, and he thought high doses of vitamin D would increase an athlete's testosterone. And so he had all the athletes on, 50 IUs twice a week, which is...
That's a lot.
That's a ton. I mean, it's medical grade. And so that's why you need a prescription to have that much vitamin D, which is also a hormone prescribed to you. You can't just pick up that much in a pill at your local drugstore. And so, he had this pet theory, and he had tested it on his sons often, and he thought that helped. And, the idea of marginal gains being if that's a 1%er, you get 10 of these 1%ers and you've got 10%. They're all going to equal maybe what an EPO would give you. And he wasn't necessarily wrong there, but he just started bumping up against the rules. And L-carnitine, another Nike Performance Lab director had brought this to Alberto. He had just run into the research in his daily work, and he said, you should look at L-carnitine. It looks like it helps athletes with fat metabolizing, meaning that they could run further on fat fuel without dipping into their carbohydrate stores, which then cause you to bonk, in their limited stores during a marathon. And so this would give an athlete extended endurance, basically. And so Alberto dug into that with this new assistant coach, Steve Magnus. And, where they went wrong was really just because, L-carnitine is an amino acid. It's hard to load into the muscle. And so you need sugar to load it into the muscle. And they found that through the research, injecting it or infusing it was the best way to get it instantly into an athlete's body. And the research was created and done by this Nottingham group, who was then going to try to commercialize it by making a drink. Well, they found out when you drink L-carnitine, it takes months for it to actually absorb into the muscle. And so Alberto just took the step of like, well, let's see how much we can infuse and still stay within the rules. But who knows what the conversations were going on behind closed doors. But he eventually infused it in at least one athlete, probably many athletes, just at a level that's not allowed. So you are not allowed to, infuse 50 milliliters and more than 50 milliliters in a 6-hour period. And so they found that if they did that, and the first athlete he did it to was this assistant coach, Steve Magnus, who was also a current athlete at the time. So it was a definite violation of the rules. But, they gave him 1,000 milliliters, so way over any ostensible sort of argument that we're doing this within the rules. And then from then on, they infused it in, athletes like Galen Rupp and Mo Farah and Dathan Ritzenheim, many of the best runners in the world. And the doctor, who was also banned with Alberto, just stopped writing down the quantity of the infusion. Right. And so, that's so obviously medical malpractice on some level. Like, there's a few things you have to write down, and one of them is the quantity of the drug that you're injecting. And so leaving that out just seems so suspicious, but it also pretty much got them off on being caught to have infused all the other athletes. But he did write down what he had infused Steve Magnus with. And so there's all this smoke around all the other athletes, but that's just one example. He frequently liked to, he'd give female athletes diuretics so they could get their weight down. He would often change their birth control, I should say, in a way that, they would menstruate less and maintain more blood, maintain more red blood cells for running. And so, everything was looked at, literally from your birth control pills to your daily vitamin. And he just kept pushing that line and sort of obsessing over each and every one of them to see if it would work. And it was really quite anecdotal. Would it work for that athlete? These weren't, this wasn't properly set up research with placebo. It was, does Dathan run a little faster today after he's had his vitamin D for 2 weeks? And so it's sort of haphazard. And there's that, in there lies the risk with the athletes. And, that we can go into examples of that, but
that's a big part of it too. And that, some of this is Salazar's own theorizing, some of it, but a lot of this work needs to happen in some sort of collaboration with a doctor. And Dr. Brown is the character that you write about. Their relationship is an interesting one because it sounds like sometimes whatever Salazar asks Dr. Brown to do, he'll do. And then other times Dr. Brown says no. And so their relationship is an interesting piece of that. And another thing we should mention are these therapeutic use exemptions, right? So there are certain categories of substances that if you've got a medically valid reason to use it, you can get an exemption for that. And doctors sort of adjudicate that process. And, and Salazar pushed the limits of that exemption process. So maybe describe that relationship between Salazar and Brown.
Yeah. So in 2004, Adam had joined the team and almost immediately started to deal with injuries and issues. And he had won a national championship and was, like I was telling you, after Bob Kennedy, he was really supposed to be the next great American athlete, but he had cratered himself essentially. And I say that, I think we talked about this earlier, but I knew I had done that to myself. So I knew this feeling. And he, after a track workout with Culpepper, another famous American athlete, he like left the track in tears, checked himself into the ER and said, I'm feeling so terrible. You have to tell me what's going on. I'm headed to the Olympics. And so his former coach at CU, Mark Wetmore, had told him about a doctor named Dr. Jeffrey Brown, who, was being heralded in the sports scene, in the national sports scene, as like the guy to go see. And he had worked with Carl Lewis and other famous athletes. And his thing was prescribing thyroid medications, thyroid hormones to athletes who probably didn't need it. We know that now. So he claims to have extended Carl Lewis's career, and he did that by giving him, we think, a thyroid medication, which can, works on your metabolism, ups your metabolism, allows you to lose weight quicker when you're trying to get down to a race weight. It gives you more energy throughout the day to train. And Salazar thought, as he thought many drugs, also helped increase testosterone. There's very scant evidence of that, but he had that pet theory. And so, you really need, if you're going to work in these gray areas, you need a doctor to help prescribe you things. And so Adam went to see the doctor, got on thyroid medication, and it should be said that he didn't test out of range. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, between 0.5 to up to 4.12 milli international units is the range. And Adam tested squarely in that range, like 5 times. So he was not someone a normal doctor would prescribe thyroid hormone to.
Okay.
But Dr. Brown prescribed it to him anyway, as he had done with, like I said, Carl Lewis and other athletes. And so Adam started racing better and feeling great. And then Alberto went to see the doctor. And now Dr. Brown's, Dr. Brown's in this weird, he has Alberto as a patient, and he has Nike as a boss where they're paying him. But he's also responsible for the athlete's care. But as there's a conflict here. So are you going to try to, regardless of the athlete's long-term health, are you just going to try to make them run really well in the next Olympics? Or are you going to do what you're supposed to, what you've taken an oath to do for their long-term health? And it seems like he just started to fall towards the pressure of making great athletes. And he loved this. He would do presentations where he, would claim that he helped Carl Lewis and others, come back from the brink and win subsequent gold medals. And so he saw himself as this groundbreaking doctor. And so Adam seems to have connected him to the team. Then Cara went and saw him, and the rest of the team sort of got in line to see Dr. Brown. And, there was nothing nefarious back in the day at the beginning, or at least maybe in Alberto's mind there was, but to the rest of the athletes, a doctor was prescribing them this substance. And so maybe some of them thought, this weird that I'm still in the range, but he thinks I should be on it. But they really did just trust their doctor wholeheartedly. And that, so the relationship between the two men, the doctor and the coach, it just evolved over time, where most of the time, Dr. Brown seemed to be, totally a team player and on Alberto's side. But there was a break. Dr. Brown seemingly really liked the limelight, and he did an interview with the Wall Street Journal about his techniques. And that, as far as I can tell, seemed to be the break between the two, because Alberto did not appreciate that, and Nike did not appreciate that Dr. Brown was sort of spilling his secrets about the thyroid hormones that he was prescribing to the athletes, to the rest of the world. And so the two had sort of a falling out there, and the rest is history. I mean, USADA, in 2015, the BBC and ProPublica, had talked to enough people to amass enough information on the tactics to report further on it, and that sort of, that and some whistleblowing really launched the USADA report, and they chased down, all credible leads, and that led to the suspension in September 30th, 2019.
What you're describing in this reporting is, it almost seems more pernicious than, the EPO, growth hormone, blood bag type of doping, because in some instances, it almost seems like the athletes, like you said, they're putting themselves in a physician's care and a coach's care, and then they're being prescribed medications that, if a doctor tells you need a medication, okay, that seems like a thing I should say yes to usually. Like there's this power dynamic there. And then so with something like L-carnitine, there's probably this like, hey, what I've never heard of this thing. What is it? Is it legal? Like these athletes seem like they're in a position where they don't really, we often put the choice to dope or not dope on the feet of the athlete. And then ultimately, like that's the person, I guess, who's deciding whether to ingest something or not. But it's not quite so simple. And this is part of the gray area too.
Yeah. I mean, the way I explain it, as you said, athletes are responsible for everything they put into their body. But if you imagine yourself, with a 6-figure contract on the Nike campus, running on the Michael Johnson track where Phil Knight can look out his window and see you every day, you are in the most legit program that there is on earth with the most powerful coach. And you just don't go into that relationship assuming that he might lead you astray. But he did. I mean, he deeply betrayed all of these athletes. There are times where, the athletes did at times protest, like the quote kind of you were just alluding to is Dathan Ritzenine asking him like, Alberto, this doesn't seem legal. Like, is this legal? And he said, yes, of course it is. But what they were doing, we found out later was, just not writing down how much the infusion they were getting infused and just kind of playing games with the rules, assuming that USADA or no one would ever go back and look at the medical records. And so, yeah, I mean, it is ultimately the athletes and what they're responsible for what they put into their body. But I mean, you have to empathize with them on some level. And I do throughout. Yeah. I mean, even in my situation where a doctor I didn't know that well had offered me testosterone. I mean, I didn't think twice about it because it was testosterone. But if you imagine that in another, as being a lesser drug or one that no one's heard of, you could take something not in your best long-term health interest, or even that could put you at risk of failing a drug test, just under the guidance of a doctor that you trust. And so with coach and doctor both telling you have to do this, the power dynamic comes in here where Alberto would sort of hold contracts over athletes' heads. And he did that with Dathan Ritzenine for sure. They stopped paying him at one point. And, Steve Magnus, also the assistant coach, he told me, they just stopped paying me at some point. And when I brought it up to Alberto, he said he'd go look into it. And he ultimately, in hindsight thought, no, he was trying to manipulate me. He was reminding me that I can stop these checks at any time.
Yep. The power
dynamic. Yeah.
So we've given, I think, hopefully the audience a lot of great reasons to check out the book, Win at All Costs. But I'd like in our remaining time, Matt, if you could indulge me, let's pull the lens back a little bit and talk about what you've learned about endurance sports, culture of performance. It's really easy to throw up your hands and sort of feel like anything you see in the Olympics or in professional sports is not real. How do you feel about sport in general and kind of the ethics of sport and maximizing performance?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. And I'm working that out every day. It was terribly disheartening. I talked to, in my work before the book, but then for the book, I talked to some experts on performance enhancing drugs. And, they'd been around the block. These are names you've probably known or have read in the paper before, but they basically would say things like, anything on television, there's such a financial incentive there that they're doing that. These are the corrupted sports, the ones you see on TV, the ones with money in them. And Adam had this, as I quote him in the book, he thought 90% of American sports are corrupted or sport is corrupted in general. I mean, he meant tennis and golf and all of them. And, it's impossible to know how true that is. I fear that that is actually the truth, where there's enough money in it. Athletes are going to cheat. So it was terribly disheartening to realize that on some level. But then, I have to say, on the very same campus, there's a coach named Jerry Schumacher who is an honest and honorable man.
Seemingly. Yeah, he seemed like a fantastic character.
Yeah. I mean, I was just blown away with him. And he was there at the same time as Alberto. And, he kept his moral compass, so to speak, pointed in the right direction, I guess. He managed to, in this environment, this win at all costs world of Nike, he had been hired. So Alberto had a heart attack in 2007. And they hired Jerry Schumacher from University of Wisconsin, this, heralded coach, to take his place because they didn't know how long Alberto was going to last. He was tired and he was having other symptoms later on. He thought he was having another heart attack. And so they're like, well, we've got Galen Rupp and Cara Goucher. We've got America's best runners. We better get them a backup coach. And so they hired Jerry. And as it turned out, Alberto came back to full health and stayed on to coach. But, Jerry just instantly came in and like clashed away from Alberto. He couldn't bring himself to believe in all of these tricks and tactics that Alberto was doing, the obsession with supplements and that kind of thing. And so he clashed and went off and started coaching the Bowerman Track Club, which still exists today. But it just goes to show, like, a guy with that kind of moral fortitude, I guess, is able to navigate those waters, even though, like, he's literally in the belly of the beast, like the expectations on his team are just as severe as they were for Alberto's team. But he couldn't bring himself to believe in this, what he saw as sort of just nonsense, wasting your time on supplements when, if you eat right, sleep right, and train right, we know those work. And that's 90% of, making a great athlete. And so he just leaned into those, and he gave me, great hope, as did Steve Magnus, who quit the program and whistle blew and now has gone on to, coach at the university level and, become somewhat of a famous coach now. Even though, Alberto, of course, tried to discredit him throughout the process. But those guys give me hope that they're willing to and doing it right. I mean, I say this in the end of the book, you might have catch the drift there, that, like, will people stick around to watch professional track and road running through all this? And that's really me. I mean, that's what I was feeling at the end of the book. Like, can I even, now that I've finished this book on this sport, will I even sit down to watch? And I think I do still, but often for the wrong reasons, for the train wreck rather than the inspirational athletes.
I remember the arc I went through with professional cycling. I mean, the Armstrong years in the Tour de France, they were some of the most fun sports fandom I ever experienced. Like, we would watch these things. It was the hero, the drama, but also, like, whatever, substances they were on, it made for, like, incredibly compelling sport to watch.
Yeah.
And it's, the sport is kind of, who knows what's happening in the sport now, but it's lost some of that excitement. You can talk about why that is. There's a bunch of reasons, but that's part of it too. It's like, I don't know if I'm interested in an NFL where players are slower and can't jump as high. It is entertainment, and ultimately the entertainment dollar is what drives it. And so it creates this weird, complicated set of incentives. And the morality behind all those things is very confusing.
Yeah, it mattered more to me when I was trying to be one of those athletes. I don't know.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now, like you said, we can look at it more just for the entertainment factor. But when it feels unfair because you're one of the athletes, and we were in a different sport, but to imagine people cheating in ultra running, would have infuriated us. We wanted a fair chance at, winning a race or performing well. And so that is one aspect that's obviously long faded for me. But, I mean, there's a number of arguments that Armstrong makes, everyone was doing it, which is completely untrue. And, well, if we're all on the same drugs, so even within, if you're all using the same drugs, as like, there's a genetic range here of who's a hyper responder and who might not respond at all.
Yeah, it's another variable.
So even if you're all on the same drugs, I hate this argument because no one points it out. You might be a hyper responder to EPO and I'm not. Or as we know from the books about the Tour de France days, Tyler Hamilton, for instance, I think it was a 96 hematocrit, and Armstrong was 92. So Armstrong could basically dope twice as much.
Yep.
Before he hit that 50% magic line that they would test the athletes for. And so Tyler could only dope a little bit, but Lance could dope a lot. And it's just like, that's not obviously not a level playing field that everyone thinks would miraculously exist if we could all just dope. And then the risks to the drugs, Salazar had the athletes on calcitonin because this drug he thought helped with stress fractures. And one of the athletes brought up to him like, hey, guys, this is correlated with increased cancer risk. And so they freaked out and took the team off it. But there's the risk in like trying anything and throwing anything at the wall. That some of these substances are dangerous. And in certain combinations for certain athletes, really dangerous. And so I can't get on board with the Wild West sort of argument, but when you're outside of the sport, like we were just talking about, and it's just entertainment for you, yeah, you do want them to be able to do the 360 windmill dunk and jump higher and run faster. But at what risk to their lives? I'm torn with the UFC, which I love to watch, but I know, it's leaving
Ultimate Fighting.
Yeah, it's leaving these athletes with brain damage, as is football. And, it's very complicated. These are nuanced issues. I mean, that's one of the reasons. I mean, that's what I tried to do in the book. This is a complicated, nuanced story. Alberto is a human being. He's not evil incarnate. He's not all bad or all good. He's a nuanced human being that's made mistakes, as have I. We all have. Nike the same way. I treat them the same way. There's great people there. There's people who make, silly or bad mistakes in an effort to win at all costs. And so hopefully the book, book length treatment of this story, I think was necessary to really lay that out. Like, this is definitely not black and white, and it's not Armstrong, injecting EPO with breakfast before he goes to dominate the tour.
100%. Well, Matt, this has been fantastic. Congratulations on the book, and so great to kind of learn more about the behind the scenes of how it came to be. I know it's a dangerous question to ask writers, but what's next for you other than fatherhood? But what's next?
Yeah. Fatherhood's coming up quick, but I'm working on a story for the New Yorker, which has kind of been a dream of mine along this
indeed
journalism route. And I know I'm at risk of saying that because you never know in this industry what's going to get published and what's not. But that's pretty much what I'm focused on now, and kind of working on a new book idea. But yeah, those are the two things really.
Well, I look forward to a time when we can get together, share some time on the trail, on the bikes, on the skis, whatever it is. Best to you and your soon-to-be family, and congratulations again on the book.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate the chat. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. A New Angle is underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot, with support from the University of Montana College of Business and Consolidated Electrical Distributors. AJ Williams is our producer. Jeff Ament, John Wicks, and VTO made our music, and Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. If you have any questions, suggestions, comments, insults, whatever, please email me at anewangle@umontana.edu. If you like what you heard, tell your friends about it. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.